Welcome to another edition of Dr. Macclevoid's New Politics, the studiously politically neutral segment that tries to make sense of British politics in a way that you won't see on other podcasts. You won't see Rory Stewart or Owen Jones saying the sorts of things I say. And that's not just because they're educated political pundits. So today we're doing something a little bit different. In this, the second ever edition of this show, I am going to be interviewing a learned commentator on British politics who knows far more than I do about the state of play in this general election campaign, and hopefully the discourse that follows will be illuminating for us all. So I'd like you to welcome, put your hands together if you will, for me, Dr. Macclevoid. Dr. Macclevoid, welcome to Dr. Macclevoid's Nude Politics. Dr. Macclevoid, can I just call you, can I just call you Doctor? Sure. I think what we'll try to do to make sense of all of this, if that's all right with you, as Steve Richards would say. Isn't it funny when he says that? Because, what if it isn't all right with us? Doesn't wait for the answer, does he? I'd just like to go through all the various political parties, the main players in the campaign, and if you would, in a way that is studiously politically neutral, if you could try to make sense of each campaign for us, okay? Sure. Okay. So let's start with the Conservatives, sometimes pejoratively referred to as the Tories. The Conservatives, how do you feel their campaign has gone, would you say? The Conservatives have had a terrible campaign, beset by all sorts of problems, not least a weakness of leadership. Rishi Sunak called the campaign prematurely, before any of the metrics of political progress with the economy could be established. Therefore, he went into the campaign without a record and without anything to vote for, except a sort of nebulous idea that you should sort of put faith in the fact that everything will be better in the future if this government, which has had an absolutely awful record over the past 14 years, is allowed to continue in office. So it's really like saying to an employer, I've done a terrible job for 14 years, but if you give me another 6 months, I'll prove to you I can turn things around. Wouldn't it have been better to turn things around over 6 months and then say to the employer, look, I've had you can see the way I've improved things and everything is on the up. Can I have another contract? But Sunak, for reasons that only he knows, decided not to wait, decided to go early, perhaps to avoid a conflict with the American election, perhaps because he didn't want a Trump victory to galvanise the vote on the left in this country, perhaps because he didn't trust that economic improvements would ensue, that those things weren't going to happen. And then he would really have nothing to talk about. Better to, say jam tomorrow or promise something on the never never than for the electorate to know that it's not going to happen. So that's one thing. But there are many people who have said in this campaign that Rishi Sunak has embraced his death drive, that he looks like a man who desperately wants to do anything else other than be Prime Minister. There's a bit of cognitive dissonance there, because I'm sure he would welcome a victory, but at the same time, deep down, he knows that he's not prime ministerial material, that he's come into the game at a point where essentially the game is already lost, and he doesn't have anything to say. He doesn't have any grand ideas about how the country should move forward. During his 18 months in office, he's cancelled HS2, the only great economy stretching infrastructure project that was in train, if you'll forgive the pun. His big ideas for the country were to ban smoking for young people. A law, incidentally, that didn't go through because he called the election before it could pass through its various stages in the Commons. So that shows you wasn't that fussed about it. So his is a strange prime ministership, a sort of an Americanized view of the world. You know, a country that doesn't need rail infrastructure, where everybody should be on a California-style health kick. That's Rishi Sunak's Britain. And Nigel Farage, when he made the sort of insidious and slightly racially tinged suggestion that Sunak didn't understand British culture, was correct, but for the wrong reason. Sunak doesn't understand British culture, but not because he is not white British, but because he's so far removed from the way ordinary Britons live. I mean, the man has £750 million in the bank and a home in California, which you'll no doubt soon return to. The world that he moves in just does not have any connectivity with the people that he presumes to govern over. And that's a huge problem. There's no empathy there. There's no understanding. Poverty is an abstraction for Rishi Sunak. Having to rely on national rail infrastructure to get to work is an abstraction for Rishi Sunak. Simply, having to worry about things like bills and paying off your car or improvements to your house or anything, just the things which make up your average voter's list of concerns are all abstractions to him. They're just little intellectual problems to be managed in a political context. And such a man really has no business being Prime Minister in the 21st century. We're way beyond that, aren't we? Surely. We've moved beyond the point where we're going to be governed by sort of, pseudo aristocrats who are keen to uphold their view of life but don't care much for the people at the bottom. That's a way of looking at it, of course. The politically neutral way of looking at it would be to say that, of course, a rich man can be empathetic, a rich man can care about the poor, aristocrats can want to improve the lives of ordinary working people. Look at Tony Benn, man who gave up being a Viscount so that he could stay in the Commons and fight for so-called ordinary people. That fucking odious phrase that doesn't really mean anything. But, not everybody has Rishi Sunak's worldview, but the fact that Rishi Sunak is a conservative and the fact that Rishi Sunak, made his money through hedge funds and, courted, the daughter of billionaires and so on, tells you that he's not really attracted to a life of so-called ordinariness, and consequently he doesn't really have any business being Prime Minister. I mean, he has not won a vote to be leader of his party. He was installed as leader of his party after the Liz Truss debacle, and he won't win this election either. So his political career will end characterised by him imposing himself on the electorate rather badly. And I suppose part of him knows that, and maybe that's the reason why he has embraced his death drive in this election. Maybe there's a part of Rishi Sunak that feels guilty about not having earned his position as Prime Minister, and consequently maybe deep down he doesn't really believe he should be Prime Minister, and that might explain why he was happy to be photographed at the Holland and Wolff yards where the Titanic was constructed and all the rest of it, and all the other nonsense that he's done in this gaff-strewn election campaign. His biggest failure, possibly, has been blindsided by Reform UK, or ReFuck, Nigel Farage's party. He thought that by embracing themes warm to the heart of ReFuck voters, the so-called conservative core vote, introducing policies like national service, that he would shoot their fox. But nobody refucks better than ReFuck, and the problem for him is that Nigel Farage is better pretending he believes in these things than Rishi Sunak. People believe Nigel Farage on the right. They don't believe Rishi Sunak. They believe that Nigel Farage is a man of the people, and Rishi Sunak is not. Of course, in reality, Nigel Farage is no more a man of the people than Rishi Sunak, but he fosters that illusion much better. He's spoken to enough ordinary folk, enough normies, enough commoners to understand what they think and why they think it, and what props to use in order to maintain the illusion of connectivity, of empathy. He's been very effective at that. And of course he's split the Conservative vote in half, which, when you're aiming for, you're pursuing a 30% or core vote strategy, is an absolute catastrophe. Nigel Farage, wasn't committing a Freudian slip when he referred to the Conservative Party as the new SDP. He's probably got that 1983 election firmly in his mind. He knows he's about to do to the Conservatives what the SDP did to the Labour Party. It's about to split their vote in half, and that's only going to increase the size of Labour's majority. So the Conservatives have had a terrible, formless campaign, beset with scandal, the betting scandal, gross distortions, and outright lies, and it's been pretty awful, but not, it has to be said, highly personal. It's not been the ugliest Conservative campaign ever, but nor has it had any distinguishing features other than its sort of lack of coherence and low energy. This is a party resigned to defeat. The only question is, how big is it going to be? And will the Conservatives exist as an electoral force after July the 4th? But we can perhaps come on later as to whether it would be a good or a bad thing if they did or they didn't. So what about the Labour Party then? What about our new Labour overlords? What are they going to be like? I mean, have you got any views on them for us? Labour, yeah. Well, the Labour campaign has been one of, breathtaking vacuity and caution. It's fueled by a pathological distrust of the electorate. Basically framed by the Thatcherite maxim that you can only win from the centre-right. For me, it's been a campaign for a tiny working majority, a sort of managerial government. I know all the polls say that Labour are going to have this super majority of 200 or what have you. And the Labour Party inwardly may believe those polls, and they may think that that's true, but they haven't campaigned in that way. They haven't campaigned like a party that expects to get a huge majority and therefore have license to do whatever it likes. This isn't a party campaigning in such a way as to say, hey, we've got this great radical programme and we know we're going to be able to put it into place because we're going to, essentially, Britain's going to become a one-party state in a few weeks' time. Not a bit of it. They're campaigning as if they're completely reliant on soft Tory votes to win, and that they expect to have a majority of 20 or something, just enough to scrape by. I suppose the question will be, what would having a supermajority do for Keir Starmer? Would he read it the way Blair read his majority of 179 and say, well, despite the enormity of this win, we only got it because we didn't deviate 1 millimetre from the centre, which of course is in reality the centre right. So therefore we don't have a mandate, we don't have a licence to move even a little bit to the left. And if we do that, then we will lose. And of course, Blairites have been emboldened in that view subsequently by the failures of Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn. So I wonder if Starmer's Labour will make the same mistake as Blair's Labour and read this as a mandate for continuity, but just a sort of more competent, slightly nicer, more caring government. In other words, conservatism with a social democratic bolt-on. And in my view, that would be a terrible mistake because, of course, the opportunity here, if you have 200, a majority of 200, is to radically reform the country and install institutions that change the way that people think about governance and change the way that they vote on a more permanent basis. In other words, you do to the country what the Conservatives did, but in reverse. The reason that this election has been fought on things like tax and spend and it's so cautious and so tepid and so lacking in vision is because Labour are broadly acknowledging that big changes, radical changes are unpalatable to the electorate, that broadly speaking they've got the kind of country they want, they just want it to work a bit better than it already does. I mean, some would argue, less politically neutral shows than this one, that the country doesn't work at all. That if you have a housing system that's propped up by the benefit system, that if most work doesn't pay well enough in order to keep people in lunches, and that they need subsidy in order to work, 40% of people on universal credit work. If wages haven't increased in real terms in 10 years, and so on and so on, if public services don't work, then the country doesn't work. But where's the mandate to change all that if you win the election promising not to put up tax? Because you can't have a real discussion, serious discussion on tax. The Conservatives and the Labour Party are both wedded to this silly idea that we can have European level public services in theory with American levels of taxation, which is just not possible. It's one or the other. There is no way to reconcile the two things. We don't have enough industry, and we don't have enough entrepreneurial zeal to power the economy in a way that we can keep taxes low while maintaining a high standard of investment in public services. We don't live in that country yet. Maybe one day, but not today. some people on the left will hope that if Starmer wins really, really big, and he effectively is his own opposition, that will empower people within the Labour Party to push the Labour Party a little bit to the left, and that they will be emboldened to make changes safe in the knowledge that they can be put through, and that given the fact that no one's listening to the opposition because they're a fractured, tortured basket case, they can simply say, okay, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it, and they can do it. They can make that argument and be heard because they're the government, and make the political weather, and win the next election on the basis that they were bold and radical, which would mark a departure from New Labour, which went into the 2001 election, mired in political apathy, saying, yeah, things are a bit better, aren't they? They're all right now. Vote for us and we'll do a bit more of that. Please God, let's not have another 13 wasted years like we did under New Labour. Yeah, if after 15 years of the next Labour government, all we can say is that we're a little bit better off in terms of our wage packet, but you still can't afford a house, public services are still not world class, and we haven't forged any closer ties to Europe, which one could argue is a positive thing. In a studiously politically neutral show like this one, you have to make up your own mind. I'm not going to tell you whether it is or it isn't. Then some would argue that is a wasted opportunity. I mean, Keir Starmer is a man who is said to have flip-flopped a lot. It's shown himself to be quite capricious. Does having no ideology mean no ideas? Is governing just about administration? I would argue, if it was, we wouldn't live in the country we do today. We haven't become the country we are because of a series of leaders who just believed in just, being a bit more efficient. That's certainly not what Clement Attlee thought, certainly not what Margaret Thatcher thought. And they're the two big shapers, if you like, of today's Britain. Much more so now, Mrs. Thatcher, of course. So, that's worth considering, isn't it?
We're in the middle of a busy election campaign, and you're thinking a lot to do every day. And then I just thought,
Yes, yes, thank you for that. And in keeping with our studious political neutrality, it's hard for me to know really which way you're leaning there. So thanks very much for not giving us any obvious cues. Let's move on, shall we, to the white elephant in the room, the Liberal Democrats. What have you made of the Liberal Democrat campaign thus far? The Liberal Democrats, what can you really say except that, Nice Ed Davies had a very silly and very reasonable campaign. He has already taken a hit for being in coalition with the Conservatives by losing his seat in 2015, so the electorate's already punished him. They're not likely to punish him twice for that. Plus, it was all such a long time ago now. I think the Liberal Democrats have distanced themselves enough from being arguably conservative enablers that they can say, well, yeah, we're back more in sort of nice guy, soft Charles Kennedy territory than, proto-Tory Nick Clegg territory. The fact that their campaign has been so low-key and pleasant and jovial has made them, I think, very hard to attack. How do you really critique sort of social democratic niceties and a commitment to make things just a little bit better than they are now? The irony is, considering how low-key and and upbeat the Lib Dem campaign has been, it's hidden the fact that they have in fact campaigned on a basis which is more radical than the Labour Party. Their campaign hasn't been galvanising in any way. It's not been populist or nonsensical either. It's not been an ugly campaign. I think most people will think a vote for the Liberal Democrats as a kind of safe vote. But the irony there is that in some respects they are proposing to do more. They're a little bit more redistributive than the Labour Party are. Plus, in one key respect, they're more radical than all the other parties, bar the SNP, who we'll come to, in that they're saying, and this is radical in the English context really, not in the Scottish context, that we should stop to creep back toward the European Union, slowly but surely. You know, they've started off by talking about freedom of movement for the under-30s. But look, everybody knows that the Liberal Democrats want to get closer to Europe. They want to be back in Europe. They want to at least be back in the single market. And the result of this general election could put the Liberal Democrats in a very strong position. Imagine, it's highly unlikely, but imagine if Ed Davey woke up on July the 5th as leader of the official opposition. Well, then he would be in a position to push the Labour Party toward the EU. A position that, of course, many people in the Labour Party would secretly be highly sympathetic toward. So voting Lib Dem might seem to be a fairly innocuous thing to do, but it could actually be something that results in a bit of a sea change. And if you're pro-European and you live in England, how are you to register this desire to be back in Europe and to be closer to Europe if you don't vote Liberal Democrat? Where else would you go? There is nowhere else to go. Just as, mind you, that didn't stop the Liberal Democrats being virtually wiped out before. It didn't stop them losing their leader, Joe Swinson, in the last election. But then they were saying something different. They were actually talking about putting us back into Europe without a referendum, which once you've put the question to a referendum, something like that, a constitutional matter like that, you must do it so again if you're going to reverse the decision. So the Liberal Democrats have not been stupid this time. They haven't put their fingers up to all those who voted leave and said, we're going to overturn your vote. They haven't done that now. And I think that that the result of their approach will be a healthy showing. Perhaps a restoration to where they were in 2010. But we shall see. We only have the polls to go on. And can we trust the polls? I don't know. Alright, well let's talk about the others then. What about Reform UK and the Workers' Party? They're an interesting duo, aren't they, Doc? Because wouldn't you agree with me, and as you're me you would, that in some respects they represent a bit of the horseshoe theory of British politics. But Nigel Farage has done very well, and George Galloway has been virtually ignored in this campaign. I don't think I've seen him once, either on television or on the radio, or maybe bleating away on YouTube, but he's been effectively invisible in this campaign. Given that the two of them might be closer together than either would like to admit, why has one succeeded and the other hasn't? Well, I would, as I'm you, I would agree with you about the horseshoe theory of politics, of course, the idea that the people on the extremes are far closer together than those in the centre, as it were. George Galloway and Nigel Farage are very, very similar in some respects. They're both anti-European. They're both anti-Western in temperament and proclivities. They flirt with totalitarian ideology. Nigel Farage is alleged to have been very proud of the fact he had the same initials as the National Front when he was at school. Now, I'm not suggesting that George Galloway is a racist, but George Galloway, of course, has employed the tactics of demagoguery in seats that he's targeted precisely to exploit religious divisions. So he's gone into his by-elections very much with ethnicity on his mind, and to exploit divisions within the population of the seats that he's contested. Why has one done well and the other hasn't done well? Well, they're both vehicles for their leaders. Refuck is just a company that exists to promote Nigel Farage, and the same is true of the Workers' Party of Great Britain. It's just a vehicle to keep George Galloway in the political spotlight. Neither man cares about his party, and both men would abandon it in a stroke if they thought that they could have any influence on a more mainstream political party and latch on to it. What Farage has done is his revenge against a Conservative Party that he feels has turned its back on his values and him specifically, and Galloway, of course, has a lifelong obsession with destroying the Labour Party for the same reasons. Why has one done well and the other hasn't done well? Well, the thing is, Nigel Farage is bound to be in the ascendant position because he is exploiting divisions in conservatism. And right now, Conservatives hate each other as well as being hated by the electorate. To go up against a government that's deeply, deeply unpopular after 14 years and is said to have betrayed its core voters is a much stronger pitch than Galloway's attempt to convince people that Keir Starmer is wishy-washy and much like all the others and therefore should be removed. There's no great discontent with the Labour Party at the moment. There may very well be after the election, but right now there isn't. The Labour Party is, riding high in the polls. They look set to win by a very huge margin. The people on the left of the Labour Party, even on the far left, even Corbynistas like Owen Jones, hate the likes of George Galloway. They can't identify with him because they are deeply suspicious of a man who is anti-European, anti-Western, and is not progressive, is a social conservative in many respects. So he doesn't share the values of a lot of the young latte-drinking whippersnappers on the left, or on the left who were once, enthusiastic Corbynistas. He can tell people that Tony Benn is his mentor all he likes, but Tony Benn was a much more collegiate and intellectual figure than George Galloway, and was not prone to making pronouncements that would get the backup of so many people on all sides of the political spectrum. So there's nowhere for, Galloway's not going to cut into Labour's vote in any significant way. True lefties are not going to vote for Galloway. Who would vote for the Workers' Party of Great Britain? I suppose people who are on some level identified as Bennite, but at the same time had a bit of a closet conservative streak in them. They might fall for Galloway's shtick if they were that way inclined. Such people do exist. Not nearly enough people to win Galloway any votes. The Workers' Party of Great Britain will return possibly only one MP, Galloway himself, and I secretly think Galloway would be perfectly fine with that. But I don't think Galloway can be in any way sure of victory in Rochdale, whereas Farage, I think, might be tasting victory in Clacton. We will see. But Farage can ride a wave of anti-conservative discontent, whereas Galloway has no wave to ride. And that's why one man is predominantly heard and considered to be an extremely important part of this election campaign, and the other is an irrelevance. But they are very, very close together politically. And both of them neither of them have a serious programme for government. The Refuck Manifesto is a fantasy manifesto, £162 billion worth of student politic garbage, rubbish, nonsense, never ever likely to be implemented in any way by any government. Even a conservative, if Farage did become Conservative leader in the next Parliament and he went to the country on that manifesto, he would be annihilated. He'd make Rishi Sunak's showing at the forthcoming election look like a dream result by comparison. So, if he did become Conservative leader, Nigel Farage would have to actually become serious and start to put forward a serious programme for government that appealed to all swathes of voters, not just a sort of cabal of disillusioned, old-fashioned right-wing conservatives. And the idea that Farage is going to sweep up Labour votes is a fantasy for the reasons that I've just outlined. If there are such discontents on the left, they're far more likely to vote for Galloway. But again, not in the numbers, not anywhere near approaching the numbers required to win under a first past the post election, which you might think is the best reason for retaining the first past the post system. Hey, it's not proportionate and maybe it's not fair, but it's extremely efficient at keeping fringe parties, pressure groups masquerading as political parties out of mainstream governance. In other words, if you don't have a serious programme for governance under first past the post, you have no prospect of becoming the government, and you might think that that is a good thing.
Will definitely be the opposition. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, super. Okay, well, finally then, let's talk about the SNP and I suppose the Greens for a laugh. What do you think? What do you have to say about our old friends, the Scottish Nationalist Party? Well, one could argue that either you see the SNP as a party that represents Scottish interests, that embody Scotland, that essentially are a proxy for the Scottish people, which is their view of themselves, or you recognise that they are ethnic nationalists, they always have been, masquerading as civic nationalists. One could argue if we have the real New Labour, which is the model that they've adopted to make their brand of exclusionary nationalism palatable to the mainstream, if we have the real New Labour in office, we don't need a self-righteous copy of it. A Labour government with strong representation in all parts of the country lays waste to the strategy of the last 14 years for the SNP. One can shoot their fox through a fair and thoughtful process of constitutional reform. We don't need to break up the country to make the country fairer for Scotland. We simply need to be united across all the nations of the UK with a government that is represented in all parts of the UK, which may be the case after the election. I think, I don't presume to speak for the Scottish people, of course, but I think that most Scots would rather have constitutional reform that acknowledges their importance to the UK and their role within the UK, and gives them a fair degree of power, a proportionate degree of power as a voting bloc, if you like, than going through the process of a divisive Indie Rev 2 that will split friends and family right down the middle, just as the first one did. The problem is, as long as independence remains 50-50, as it does in most polls, as we've seen with Brexit, that is a formula for splitting people apart. That's not a political consensus. That's division. Such a big constitutional change requires a much larger share of the vote, maybe 2/3, in order for it to not be so decisive, for it not to tear away its social cohesion. You want a country that is united around an idea, not split by an idea, I would argue. And I would have said, for the same reason, that the threshold for leaving the European Union should have been a lot higher. It should have been, say, 66% or something like that. Two-third majority. Because of the scale of the change, the implications of such a change, both socially and economically. So, the SNP are likely to go backwards in the next Parliament, likely to have less MPs and probably less MSPs when the next Scottish election comes round. And I have to say, I think that will be a good thing for Scotland. I think it will be healthy. One party rule is not healthy. And I say that as somebody who's got one eye on this election result and thinks that Labour will probably become the dominant party throughout the land. But, you know, it's tricky. No party, it's a question of how long that the party has that sort of prominence and what it does with the size of its majority. One can be fairly sure that the Labour Party will not consciously or deliberately do anything to weaken the social cohesion of the United Kingdom as a whole, whereas of course the SNP is ideologically committed to breaking up the UK, and that's why I think that sort of nationalism should be resisted, and why a sort of unifying social democratic coalition that serves the interests of all the participating nations, perhaps in a more federated way, is the way forward. But that's just a point of view, of course. In a politically neutral show like this one has to say all opposing points of view are equally valid, even if they are emphatically wrong. You didn't really mention the Greens. Sorry, who are they? They're another party that's running in the election. Yeah, I mean, the Greens are a pressure group masquerading as a political party. They have no relevance in a first-past-the-post system, really. I mean, it's good to have them around, I suppose, but unless there's PR, they're never going to have a serious bearing on the shape of the UK government. I mean, it's good to have them around. It's nice for them. Nice they exist. Good for them. Okay, well, thank you. So, I suppose that's it, is it? I mean, is there anything else you want to say about the election? Only that everything I've said, the opposite will be true for somebody else. So I suppose you can ignore everything I've just said, if you want to. It's all speculation anyway, isn't it? I mean, we won't know anything until the morning of July the 5th. So, but those have been my sort of surface, light touch impressions of things. But I could be wrong. Well, thanks. That's it. That's hugely useful then. A productive waste of all of our time. So, thank you to me for that. Thank you. Yes. So that was this sort of election overview from Dr. Macclevoid's New Politics. We'll be back after the election for a review of the election result. What happened? Who won? It's just too close to call. Until next time, I'm Dr. Bye.
I was certain that we would lose it. I did campaign for Labour. Of course I did. I will openly say I campaigned for Labour. I wanted good colleagues to be returned into the Labour Party.
When you said it.
And I wanted a party that was capable of being changed so we could face the future again.
Did you not mean it when you said it?
I was certain that we would lose. And I think many other people were certain that we would lose.
So you didn't mean it?
I was certain that we would lose.